I'm pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on human rights in El Salvador. This is our third hearing on the state of exception in El Salvador. The first was in September 2022, 6 months after the Salvadoran legislature approved President Bukele's request for a 30-day state of exception to deal with gang violence. The government argued that a suspension of civil liberties and rule of law was necessary to deal with the problem. The second was December 2024, with the state of exception on its 33rd extension. Witnesses testified to continuing violence and continuing violations of human rights in that country. I saw this with my own eyes. I just returned from a visit to the country to commemorate the 35th anniversary of the assassination of 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper and her daughter, by U.S.-trained Salvadoran security forces. In El Salvador, what I found was an atmosphere of fear and self-censorship. Family members cried as they told me how their sons and daughters, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters were captured by security forces, how they tried in vain to find out where their relatives had been taken and why, and to provide them with needed food and medicine, only to learn that they had died in custody under unknown circumstances. As we convene this hearing, the state of exception has been renewed 49 times. 49 times. A state of exception, by definition, should be just that, a temporary measure designed to address an extraordinary circumstance. Now, in its 5th year, we must ask whether it has become a state of permanence. President Bukele said it was to deal with gang violence, long a persistent threat to the lives and livelihoods of Salvadorans. No one disputes that the government is obligated to respond to gang violence. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights provides that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. But international rights law also obligates the government to protect people from abuses like enforced disappearances and arbitrary detention, and to guarantee their right to freedom of assembly and expression, including to a free press. Key questions we hope to address today: as the state of exception has gone beyond its original stated purpose and become a tool to cement authoritarian control for a president who engineered himself a second unconstitutional term in office? Does international human rights law have a popularity exemption from obligations? In other words, does the purported popularity of a government leader immunize him or her from accountability for human rights violations on their watch? Now, let us take stock of what has happened since our last hearing. 1, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights expressed, quote, grave concern about restrictions on human rights defenders in civil space. 2, UN experts condemned the enforced disappearance of human rights defender Ruth Lopez. 3, Human Rights Watch and Cristasol issued a comprehensive report on torture and other abuses against Venezuelans in the COMPLICIT prison. 4, Freedom House assessed El Salvador, along with Madagascar, with the 3rd largest decline in political rights and civil liberties in the world. 5, Reporters Without Borders ranked El Salvador low in its press freedom ranking at number 135, 1 spot above Somalia, noting that government persecution and harassment has forced many media outlets to close or to flee the country. 6, an international group of human rights experts assessed that crimes committed by the government during the state of exception may constitute crimes against humanity. And what did the State Department say in its annual report? We quote, "There were no credible reports of significant human rights abuses," end quote. That's the U.S. State Department's annual report. This is a lie, and I've been there, and I've seen the results of these abuses with my own eyes, and I've talked to countless Salvadorans who have come to Washington to give me their personal testimony. This is an insult to all those whose human rights have been violated. This is a cover-up. Previous annual reports documented human rights abuses by Salvadoran security forces and in Salvadoran prisons. It calls into question the integrity of the Human Rights Report under Secretary Rubio. It makes us wonder whether the administration is putting personal politics above human rights. Both Co-Chair Smith and I have said on numerous occasions that we should not be afraid to criticize our own government when it comes to human rights. Sometimes it is when our government is not doing enough. Other times it is because we are taking the entirely wrong approach. I take a firm position that the United States government should not be complicit in human rights abuses committed by other governments. That was the principle behind the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the bipartisan bill which Senator Rubio, Co-Chair Smith, Senator Merkley, and I successfully got into law. That principle should apply with El Salvador, too. As always, we depend on witnesses to offer recommendations for U.S. policy. Today, that is especially relevant, and I look forward to the testimony. And I know Co-Chair Smith is probably on his way over here. Again, vote just ended, but I would yield to Congressman Vargas from California if he has anything he wants to add.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you and also Congressman Smith for convening this incredibly important hearing. For me, it's an incredibly personal topic because in my 20s, I served as a Jesuit novice in El Salvador in an orphanage during the Civil War. I saw firsthand the human rights abuses that were committed against political dissidents and normal people alike, everybody. And this is why I'm at this hearing today, again, concerned about the situation in El Salvador. President Bukele has extended the state of exception 48 times, allowing for due process violations and arbitrary mass detentions to occur. We have heard the reports of journalists being threatened and of the government directly targeting NGOs and nonprofits. COMPLICIT has been described as a hell on earth, yet the United States entered into an agreement last year to send immigrants like Kilmar Obrego Garcia to this mega prison without trial. We have an important duty as members of Congress to ensure that human rights are being upheld in El Salvador, and that's why, again, I thank the chair and I thank the co-chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me yield to Representative Omar if she has any. Do you have any? No. Okay. We'll go right into the to our panel. Let's make sure. Okay. No, we're going to go to Co-Chair Smith, who just arrived in the nick of time.
Thank you. Hello to my colleagues, and welcome to our very distinguished witnesses. I appreciate all of you being here today. And just let me say, as I noted at our third hearing back in December of 2024, any serious discussion of El Salvador today must begin with a basic and undeniable fact: the dramatic transformation in the country's security situation. Just a few years ago, El Salvador was among the most violent countries in the world, with gangs exercising pervasive control over daily life, extorting families, recruiting children, and terrorizing entire communities. Today, by all available measures, that reality has been changed profoundly and dramatically. Homicide rates have plummeted, extortion has declined, and ordinary Salvadorians are able to go about their daily lives with a degree of safety that was previously unimaginable. El Salvador is today one of the most safest communities in the world. I would note, parenthetically, that some of my first human rights trips were to El Salvador when the FMLN was committing heinous terrorist acts, and the right-wing death squads were also murdering and killing and doing terrible things. But that has morphed into the gangs. And I had them in my own district. I've had Trenton previously in my district, and we had gangs there from Central America, including from El Salvador, who committed very, very serious human rights abuses in my own district. So I know what gangs can do. We also had a number of trafficking situations, including from other Central American countries, and worked to repatriate those women, but they were brought to my district by gangs. So gangs jumps off the page as a very serious problem. As Andres Martinez Fernandez will testify today, quote, confronting the gangs in El Salvador has led to a 54% reduction in extortion complaints compared to 2023. Similarly, homicide rates fell a stunning 98%. 98% from 2015 to 2024, with homicide going from the highest in the world in 2015 at 106 per 100,000 people to just, and it's not just, it's still a homicide, 1.9 in 2024. Other forms of crime, including sexual assaults, robbery, and human trafficking, and human trafficking is an issue close to me. I've written 5 laws on combating human trafficking, including the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, which has put over 5,000 of the worst. Jeffrey Epstein was being prosecuted under that. Maxwell got 20 years under my law, and we know that it is all over the world that we combat that heinous modern-day slavery that is occurring. And all of those things have seen a positive net advancement towards those things ending. This transformation for the better explains in large part the continued and overwhelming support of the President Bukele enjoys among the Salvadorian people. His re-election with an extraordinary margin and consistently high approval ratings reflect the judgment of a population that has experienced firsthand the benefits of restored public order. That judgment deserves respect. At the same time, I've also emphasized previously, and I do again today, respect for democratic choices does not eliminate the importance of fundamental rights or the rule of law. The same state of exception, I should say, now entering its 5th year, has involved the suspension of certain constitutional protections in the areas of due process and criminal procedure. Concerns have been raised legitimately by human rights organizations, international bodies, and others regarding allegations of arbitrary detention, prison conditions, and limitations in civil liberties. This hearing is an opportunity to again examine these concerns, but also within the context. When you're afraid to go outside your door, I remember on one of my trips to El Salvador being told, no American should be here, you're going to get shot. I went anyway. Thankfully, I didn't get shot, but the FMLN had targeted Americans, particularly Republicans, who were pushing for peace and reconciliation in that country. It's important to acknowledge that the primary and most pervasive violation of human rights of Salvadorians for many years are the gangs. And let's not forget the gangs. They've operated with impunity. They don't anymore, although they're still there, and they pose, I think, a very significant threat. I do have more that I will put into the record, but again, I welcome all of you. And again, 98% reduction in the homicide rate is an amazing advancement.
Thank you very much. Let me introduce our panel. First, Sergio Arauz is the president of the Association of Journalists of El Salvador, which is a professional organization that documents and denounces judicial harassment, illegal surveillance threats, and forced exile affecting dozens of Salvadoran journalists. He's also deputy editor-in-chief of El Faro, where he specializes in corruption, politics, and organized crime. He'll be aided by a translator here today. I should also add for the record, he's been forced into exile because it is no longer safe for him to be in El Salvador. Isabel Carlotta Roby is senior staff attorney for Latin America at the Robert and Ethel Kennedy Human Rights Center, where she leads strategic litigation and advocacy initiatives across the region, including in El Salvador, Venezuela, Guatemala, Brazil, and Cuba. She holds a law degree from the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello in Caracas, Venezuela, her hometown. Noah Bullock is executive director of Cristasol, a human rights organization with 25 years of experience in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. His work at Cristasol includes transitional justice and protection of victims of internal displacement and the promotion of rule of law, democratic security, and anti-corruption. Among his academic work is a postgraduate degree from Central American University in San Salvador. Juan Papier is the America's Deputy Director at Human Rights Watch, overseeing research and advocacy efforts in the region on abuses related to armed conflicts, security policies, and attacks on the rule of law in Latin America. Among his degrees is a Master of Law from the Graduate Institute of International and Developmental Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. Susanna Sokotu. I'm from Massachusetts, so my accent, I can't pronounce, anyway, she directs the War Crimes Research Office at American University's Washington College of Law. She has advised and provided legal assistance on international criminal law with a focus on the intersection with gender. She is a co-founder of the Latin American Network for Gender-Based Strategic Litigation, among other efforts. Is that it? Oh, wait, no, I'm getting your bio. Andres Martinez Fernandez, who's a senior policy analyst for Latin America at the Heritage Foundation, and he has a long history of being involved in monitoring these issues. We welcome you here as well. And we will insert all of your lengthy biographies in the record, but for the sake of time, we've abbreviated them a little bit. But we'll begin with Mr. Arauz. Why don't we begin with your testimony?
Thank you. My name is Carlos Martinez de la Serna. I'm the Chief Program Officer of the Committee to Protect Journalists, CERC, a nonprofit organization based in New York. CERC is going to read CERC's brief testimony in Spanish, and I will read in English on his behalf. Thank you.
Gracias. Congresistas, seré breve y directo. Les agradezco la oportunidad de escuchar este testimonio que doy desde el exilio y su interés en entender los efectos que tiene la eliminación de derechos en mi país. Las consecuencias de entregar un poder sin límites a una sola persona conduce a un gobierno donde lo público se convierte en secreto y donde el poder de las instituciones es sustituido por el de una familia, la familia del presidente. El Salvador ya no es un lugar seguro para quienes ejercemos el periodismo. Hoy se ha normalizado la persecución sistemática de cualquier voz crítica y disidente. Volvieron los tiempos de cárceles con presos políticos, de espionaje para quienes piensan distinto, de hombres armados que llegan a las casas de civiles por solo pensar distinto, con el fin de intimidar y generar miedo. Casos concretos. Yo fui infectado por el virus Pegasus junto con otros colegas salvadoreños, 34 colegas salvadoreños. Metieron presa a la querida Ruth López, apreciada abogada también de Cristosal, y 2 días después de la captura yo recibí llamadas de agentes del Estado para persuadirme de salir del país. Yo salí del país el 21 de mayo y no he vuelto a regresar. Vivimos tiempos de matonería política y de represión. Cualquier persona que incomoda al presidente y sus intereses tiene miedo y puede sufrir las consecuencias. De todo esto hay datos y un registro documentado realizado por colegas y organizaciones de sociedad civil. Hoy, todas ellas están pagando las consecuencias de guiarse por sus principios. Informes de todo tipo y con distintos métodos concluyen que El Salvador ya no es una democracia. El índice de Chapultepec de libertad de expresión ubica a El Salvador con apenas 24 puntos sobre 100, con la franja de alta restricción. Estamos solo por debajo de Cuba. Es la primera vez en la historia que este índice nos ubica a la par de Nicaragua y Venezuela. Solo Nicaragua y Venezuela nos superan en persecución de periodistas. El Faro, el medio en el que yo trabajo, es acusado de lavado de dinero por el presidente Bukele. Él también dice que la Asociación de Periodistas de El Salvador es un club de criminales. Pero persigue a la prensa porque ha hecho su trabajo. Hemos desnudado sus pactos con las pandillas. Hemos hablado del inexplicable crecimiento de su riqueza y de su círculo familiar. Hemos denunciado las incontables violaciones a los derechos humanos. Aunque se habla de un país seguro, no hay libertades ni Estado de Derecho. Cualquier turista puede pasearse por el país sin temor a que le roben o secuestren, pero existe un lado oscuro. No hay libertad plena y esto convierte a El Salvador en un país tan seguro como Corea del Norte o Nicaragua. Son seguros, pero sin libertades. Debajo de la alfombra, El Salvador esconde mucho miedo. 6 de cada 10 salvadoreños tienen miedo de opinar sobre política. 53 periodistas están en el exilio por temor a una captura arbitraria. Más de 100 personas defensoras de derechos humanos dejaron su territorio por miedo e intimidación. El régimen de excepción usa la excusa de la seguridad para detener a cualquier persona por su forma de vestir, por ponerse nerviosa o por llenar una cuota. Hay registros de 245 casos de persecución política y 86 presos políticos. No han encarcelado solo a pandilleros, han encarcelado a campesinos, líderes comunitarios, sindicalistas, periodistas y defensores de derechos humanos. Lo hemos documentado y nos están persiguiendo por documentarlo. La reciente aprobación de la Ley de Agentes Extranjeros es el más reciente instrumento de persecución. Está diseñado para asfixiar financieramente a todas las organizaciones que disienten. A la APES, a la Asociación de Periodistas del Salvador, se le está negando su derecho a tener un registro legal en el país. Eso viola el derecho a organizarnos. El Salvador necesita que el mundo vea lo que nosotros estamos viviendo desde adentro. Un Estado que ha convertido la represión en una forma de gobernanza y utiliza la seguridad como excusa para silenciar a quienes le incomodan. Muchas gracias.
Members of Congress, I thank you for the opportunity to present this testimony from exile and for your interest in understanding the consequences of the erosion of rights in my country. The consequences of granting unchecked power to a single individual lead to a government where public affairs become secret and where institutional power is replaced by the president's family. El Salvador is no longer a safe place for those of us who practice journalism, understood as a profession that seeks accountability from public power. Today, the systematic persecution of any critical or dissenting voice has become normalized. The time of prisons with political prisoners have returned, of surveillance against those who think differently, of armed men arriving at civilians' homes to intimidate and instill fear. Concrete cases. I was infected with Pegasus along with 34 Salvadorian colleagues. The outspoken lawyer Ruth Lopez was imprisoned, and I received multiple messages from state agents persuading me to leave my country on May 21st of last year. We're living in times of political thuggery and repression against anyone who challenges President Bukele or his interest. There is data and documented evidence of all this, compiled by colleagues and civil society organizations that are now paying the price for standing by their principles. Reports of all kinds and using different methodologies conclude that El Salvador is no longer a democracy. The Chapultepec Index of Freedom of Expression ranks El Salvador at just 24 out of 100 points in the high restriction category, below Cuba for the first time in the history on the index. Only Nicaragua and Venezuela surpasses in the persecution of journalists. El Faro has been accused of money laundering by President Bukele. APES is described as a club of criminals. The press is persecuted for doing its job, exposing his pacts with gangs, the inexplicable growth of wealth among his family circle, and reporting countless human rights violations. Although its people speak of a safe country, there are no freedoms or rule of law. Any tourist can walk around without fear or robbery or kidnapping, but there is a dark side. There is no full freedom, and that makes El Salvador as safe as North Korea or Nicaragua. Beneath the surface, there is a great deal of fear. 6 out of 10 Salvadorians are afraid to express political opinions. More than 50 journalists are in exile for fear of arbitrary arrest. More than 100 human rights defenders have left the country due to fear and intimidation from security forces that use the state of exception to detain anyone based on how they dress, if they appear nervous, or simply to meet quotas. There are records of 245 cases of political persecution and 86 political prisoners. The regime has not only imprisoned gang members, it has imprisoned farmers, community leaders, union members, journalists, and human rights defenders. We have documented this, and we have been persecuted for documenting it. The recent approval of the foreign agent laws is the latest instrument of that persecution. Designed to financially suffocate independent media, civil society organizations, it forces them to register in a state system and subjects every international transfer to burdensome withholdings. APES is being denied its right to organize in El Salvador, and we are being denied formal registration as an association. El Salvador needs the world to see what we haven't seen from within, a state that has turned repression into a model of governance and uses security as an excuse to silence those who challenge it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Roby.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Smith. My remarks will focus on the arbitrary detention and forced disappearance and torture at Secot, and how these abuses reflect a broader pattern under El Salvador's state of exception. Since the emergency decree in El Salvador in March 2022, more than 90,000 people have been detained and roughly 500 have died in state custody. Many are held in Secot, the same prison the Trump administration paid to detain migrants who were illegally deported and disappeared. On February 3, 2025, President Nayib Bukele announced that El Salvador will detain individuals sent from the United States in exchange for a fee. In the weeks that follow, both governments entered into a secret agreement under which deportees were held in El Salvador. But in practice, this meant indefinite incommunicado detention at Secot. Critically, it is highly likely that U.S. authorities knew or reasonably should have known of the serious risk of human rights abuses, including torture, in detention centers in El Salvador before entering into this agreement. Since then, El Salvador accepted and imprisoned approximately 288 individuals transferred by the United States at Secot. This group includes approximately 252 Venezuelan nationals and 36 Salvadoran nationals who were transferred by flights operated by the United States between March and April 2025. The exact number remains unknown, as El Salvador has refused to disclose the exact number. While most Venezuelans were later released in a prisoner exchange, at least 36 Salvadorans remain detained. During an on-site visit to El Salvador in April 2025, together with other representatives of the Kennedy Human Rights Center, we attempted to visit 10 of our clients who were held at Secot to assess their physical and psychological well-being. Despite following all official channels, our efforts were ultimately unsuccessful. Moreover, families challenged the detention through habeas petitions and information requests in El Salvador, but authorities failed to respond, leaving them without recourse. Meanwhile, El Salvador denied responsibility before UN human rights bodies, claiming it neither arrested nor transferred the detainees and asserting that jurisdiction rested exclusively within the United States. Following the July 19, 2025 transfer of more than 250 Venezuelan detainees from Secot, we managed to interview some of the survivors. Their accounts reveal a clear pattern of abuse and torture. For security reasons, victims' identities remain confidential. The victims were transferred without being told they were being taken to Secot, or even that they were being taken to El Salvador. From the moment they arrived in El Salvador and throughout their detention at Secot, the victims were subjected to systematic and brutal physical and psychological abuse. Quote, "When we arrived, there was only one Salvadoran present, and he told us, 'Welcome to Bukele's regime,' unquote." Victims were beaten for minor infractions, including speaking or looking at guards. Many were shot with rubber bullets in collective punishments. Injuries included broken ribs, dislocated joints, head wounds, and lasting nerve damage that went untreated. Other victims suffered extreme physical abuse in the isolation cell known as La Isla, the island. CU recounted, quote, "They took me several times to La Isla, where they handcuffed and beat us until we fainted. The last time I had a fever and begged for a doctor. Instead, 5 guards beat me, knelt me down, hit my stomach, and kicked me on the ground before leaving me in isolation until the evening," end of quote. At least one victim recounted sexual abuse in isolation. A.H., a gay makeup artist, recounted, quote, "Officers dragged me to La Isla, a dark isolation cell. 3 of them stayed, forced me to my knees, and one of the officers grabbed me by the head and forced me to give him oral sex. My hands were handcuffed behind my back. I cried and begged them to stop. It lasted what felt like 2 hours before they took me back to my cell," end of quote. Victims endured systematic psychological torture. They were told they had arrived in hell, would never leave, and that the only way out was in a black bag. Guards threatened to kill or disappear them, denied their humanity, and humiliated them until they broke. At times, they even urged them to take their own lives. RM recounted in his own words, quote, "They told us that the only way we were going to get out of Secot was in a black bag, that they were going to give us a life sentence. A cellmate was told that they had barrels of acid where they put gang members when they died, and that no one was going to find the bodies. Several times the guards told us that human rights did not exist in Secot." End of quote. What happened to Venezuelan detainees at Secot is not isolated. It reflects ongoing abuses under El Salvador's state of exception, enabled by secrecy, denial, and impunity. These violations demand accountability from both the United States and El Salvador, as well as justice, reparations, and urgent measures to prevent recurrence. These include adopting concrete guarantees of non-repetition, such as prohibiting third country transfers, publishing the bilateral agreement between El Salvador and the United States, supporting the creation of an independent national or hybrid commission to review detention cases under the state of exception in El Salvador, and ensuring sustained support for independent media, without which there can be no accountability. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bullock.
Distinguished members of the Commission, after 4 years under a state of exception, the security environment in the country of El Salvador has transformed. The criminal violence of gangs has been replaced by the corruption and violence of an autocratic regime. As a human rights organization that's provided assistance to victims of gang violence, as well as state repression, we believe Salvadorans deserve better options than living subjugated to the violence of gangs or the repression of dictatorships. As we sit here today, Salvadorans continue to suffer human rights abuses, and new cases of torture and deaths in custody of the state emerge regularly. Since January alone, our team of investigators has registered 93 new prison deaths, bringing the total number of deaths documented by Crystal Sal to 513, of which 420 we have fully investigated and documented. Our methodology for case documentation draws on health records, death certificates, coroner's reports, witnesses' testimonies, photographic evidence, and forensic assessments conducted by external experts. The causes of death identified in our investigations reveal a consistent pattern of severe physical abuse, medical neglect, and inhumane conditions directly attributable to the state. Physical violence is reflected in 181 of the deaths we've documented, while pulmonary and cerebral edemas was listed as the official cause. And in 168 cases where victims sustained trauma to the head, chest, or abdomen, injuries consistent with beatings. Hyperbolic shock, linked to hemorrhaging or dehydration or burns, accounts for 24 of the deaths. 16 detainees died of asphyxia by hanging or strangulation. Though 6 of these were classified by officials as suicides, evidence shows that in at least 5 cases, the forensic evidence doesn't support that cause. Denial of medical care is evident in at least 73 of the cases attributed to cardiac conditions. 71 cases died of infectious diseases, including pneumonia, tuberculosis, and meningitis, that received no medical care. And 54 were directly linked to infections. Sepsis claimed the lives of 49 people. Renal failure developed in 52 cases, 33 of which had no prior medical issues before being detained, strongly suggesting that their condition was caused by the confinement itself. Inhumane conditions are further demonstrated in 36 deaths from severe malnutrition, 7 from dehydration, reflecting the deliberate deprivation of food, water, and basic hygiene. Under the Bukele regime, the Salvadoran justice systems and prisons have become tools for punishment and intimidation of dissent. In March, Crystal Sal published a report studying 245 cases of citizens who suffered judicial or extrajudicial persecution due to their profiles as members of the political opposition, community leaders, environmental and human rights defenders, journalists, academics, and even former allies and collaborators of the Bukele regime. The study includes the cases of disappearance, torture, and killings of former friend and advisor to the president, Alejandro Mason, after he had denounced corruption in the president's party. The report also documents a pattern of persecution of family members as retribution against Salvadorans who make critical statements about the regime, exemplified by the detention of the son of indigenous environmental activist Silverio Morales. The report assesses 186 cases of judicial persecution, 86 of which remain in prison. These cases demonstrate how the exceptions to due process rights, allegedly necessary to combat organized crime in the country, are now being used against human rights defenders, like my friend and colleague Ruth Lopez, the head of our anti-corruption unit. Ruth was arrested in May and has been in prison for nearly a year without trial. For the majority of her imprisonment, she has been held incommunicado, without access to her family or legal counsel. At the request of the prosecution, the judge in Ruth's case ruled that Ruth will be tried in secret, despite her very public demand for a public trial. Her arrest and judicial proceedings against her have been riddled with irregularities and illegalities that make clear the regime's intent to punish Ruth for her role in the fight against corruption and send a message to the Salvadoran public to deter and silence dissent. I ask the honorable members of this commission to join Ruth's family in demanding that her rights to a fair, speedy, and public trial be upheld, that she has access to her family and defense while held in detention, but ultimately that she be released from pretrial detention, which the Salvadoran legal system, should be an exception, but under the Bukele regime has become the standard. With tens of thousands of Salvadorans detained and disappeared under the state of exception, Ruth's arrest and the capture of constitutional lawyer Enrique Anaya days later detonated an exodus of civil society leaders, human rights defenders, and journalists. They rationally determined that the Bukele regime has unrestricted power to arrest and detain indefinitely whoever it wants, and there are no institutions in the country with sufficient independence and authority to intervene to protect the rights of citizens. The Bukele regime insists that anyone who questions their security model is defending the rights of criminals over the rights of victims. The regime is profoundly mistaken on this point. Human rights organizations have advocated for the rights and provided assistance to victims of gang violence for years. We are in full agreement that the state has a responsibility to protect citizens from crime and violence. Our disagreement with the regime centers around the necessity to use policies that amount to crimes against humanity to achieve it. Thank you for the time.
Thank you. Mr. Papier.
Distinguished co-chairs Smith and McGovern, distinguished members of the Commission, I'm honored to appear before this Commission to testify on behalf of Human Rights Watch regarding the human rights situation in El Salvador during the ongoing state of emergency. For 4 years, El Salvador has been under a state of emergency that suspends basic due process rights. As you know, security forces report arresting over 91,000 people. Homicide rates have dropped significantly, notoriously, and in our interviews across the country, people consistently report feeling safer from gang violence that terrorized El Salvador for decades. There's no denying of that or of the importance of that for the human rights of Salvadorians. At the same time, security forces have committed widespread human rights violations. Through interviews in El Salvador and reviews of judicial documents, Human Rights Watch has identified dozens, many cases of arbitrary arrest of people with no connection to gangs. Victims include children, boys and girls as young as 12, as well as people with disabilities and other ordinary, hardworking Salvadorians. Police officers told Human Rights Watch that some arrests are driven by a policy of quotas, requiring officers to arrest a certain number of people per day. They told us that the arrests are based on dubious or fabricated evidence, including patently false information included in police reports, as well as uncorroborated anonymous calls. The officers described to us a climate of impunity that led some to demand bribes and in some cases sex from women in exchange for not arresting their relatives. Roughly 90% of those detained during the state of emergency remain in pretrial detention, according to government figures. President Bukele has argued that police officers around the world make mistakes and that the justice system will eventually release those wrongfully detained. However, a combination of lack of judicial independence, sweeping changes to criminal laws that undermine due process, and the immense workload faced by public defenders make it harder, if not virtually impossible, for many detainees to obtain meaningful legal recourse. Police officers have told us that they have instructions to immediately rearrest people who have been released. We have also documented cases of people who have not been released despite pending court orders. Lawmakers have created mass hearings where reportedly up to 1,800 people, 1,800 defendants in the same hearing taken before the same judge. That makes it virtually impossible to assess whether each of them bears criminal responsibility. In the meantime, the people detained remain under inhumane prison conditions, exposed to a high risk of abuse. Even after the inauguration of the Center for Confinement of Terrorism, COMPLICIT, the largest prison in the Western Hemisphere, Human Rights Watch estimates that El Salvador is exceeding its prison capacity by 238%. Over 500 detainees have died, as Noah mentioned, according to reports by Cristosal, and we have identified evidence pointing to state responsibility in many of these cases. Former detainees we interviewed described being held in cells with so much overcrowding that they can barely move or have to take turns to sleep on the floor or standing. We have also documented multiple cases of torture in several Salvadorian prisons. This includes severe beatings, waterboarding, and mock executions, among other practices. Our latest report on El Salvador, conducted jointly with Cristosal, You Have Arrived in Hell, documents similar cases of torture and other forms of abuse against the Venezuelans the United States government deported to El Salvador in March 2025. The report, based on almost 200 interviews and forensic and digital evidence, found that these men were subject to arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, torture, inhumane detention conditions, and in some cases to sexual violence. The Venezuelan men we interviewed told us they were tortured on a near daily basis. They said they were beaten when they arrived, during daily searches, for speaking with the Red Cross, for speaking to each other. They were even beaten for requesting to see a doctor. We found that these abuses were not isolated incidents by rogue guards or police, but rather systematic violations that appeared to be designed to subjugate, humiliate, and discipline these detainees. The US Congress should push the administration to stop supporting these abuses in El Salvador and to end the complicity with grave human rights violations against deportees sent to that country. Members should demand the US government stop transferring people to El Salvador or any other countries where they face a similar risk of abuse. Congress should ensure that any financial, technical, or security assistance to El Salvador's prison system or security forces are conditioned on demonstrable improvements on human rights. Senior officers responsible for grave human rights violations should be sanctioned, never praised or applauded. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Sakotu.
Chairman McGovern, Smith, and distinguished members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to testify today about the findings and recommendations of the recent report of the International Group of Experts for the Investigation of Human Rights Violations under the state of emergency or the state of exception in El Salvador, of which I was a member. I want to begin with one fundamental point. Responding to acts of violence attributed to gangs is entirely legitimate. The impact of gang violence is real and devastating, and states, including El Salvador, have a duty to protect their populations and ensure public security in accordance with the law. That duty is not in dispute. What is in dispute is the manner in which that duty is carried out. Security policies cannot be implemented at the cost of serious human rights violations. They must comply with the rule of law and regional and international human rights standards. After a thorough investigation, our report reached the following conclusion. There are reasonable grounds to believe that El Salvador's response to gang violence since the state of emergency was declared in March of 2022 meets the elements of crimes against humanity under the Rome Statute establishing the International Criminal Court. That conclusion is based on extensive, verifiable sources that are fully documented in the report. The figures, as we've just heard, are alarming. Thousands of more than the 90,000 detentions carried out under the state of emergency were arbitrary or conducted without due process. President Bukele himself has acknowledged that 8,000 detentions lacked legal grounds. At least over 400, and now we just heard from NOAA that up to 513 people have died while in state custody. And of course, we've had hundreds of enforced disappearances have been documented. Even these figures likely understate the reality. Official information remains fragmented and subject to secrecy, and many families still do not know the whereabouts of their loved ones. The report also finds that the repeated and indefinite extension of the state of emergency, recounted by the chair, now prolonged more than 49 times, combined with the undermining of judicial independence, has transformed what were meant to be exceptional measures into a permanent and increasingly repressive system of governments. As we've heard, thousands of people are held incommunicado, mass hearings are held without individualized evaluation of evidence, and access to information is severely restricted. These practices are extensively documented in the report. What does that mean? Under Article 7 of the Rome Statute, crimes against humanity are defined as a multiplicity of prohibited acts constituting serious violations of human rights, committed against a civilian population, in furtherance of a state organizational policy, carried out in a widespread or systematic manner with knowledge of the attack. In other words, crimes against humanity are not defined solely by the gravity of the acts. What makes them distinct is that they reflect an organized and cumulative pattern of extremely serious violations rather than isolated incidents, meaning they capture organized, collective repression rather than random or sporadic abuses by rogue actors. Our report identifies two distinct but connected attacks against the civilian population. The first targets alleged gang members or those perceived as such and includes arbitrary detentions, torture, enforced disappearances, deaths in custody, sexual violence, and other inhumane acts. The second targets political opponents or those perceived as such and includes arbitrary detentions, inhuman treatment, torture, deaths in custody, and political persecution. There is a connection between those two. The report finds that practices initially justified as extraordinary measures against gangs were progressively extended to other segments of the civilian population, including those perceived as political opponents. Importantly, the report finds that these violations were enabled by a pattern of institutional weakening, both prior to and following the declaration of the state of emergency, including criminal and procedural reforms that have steadily dismantled due process and other fundamental protection. These facts, among others, led us to conclude that the abuses documented were not isolated incidents, but part of a sustained policy that has been publicly endorsed and executed over time. As a result, the report finds that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the documented acts satisfy the elements of crimes against humanity under the Rome Statute. Given the gravity and seriousness of the violations document, the report calls on El Salvador to immediately restore the rule of law by ending the state of emergency and rescinding all emergency-related criminal and procedural reforms that suspend fundamental rights. To be clear, the report does not call for the release of all detainees. It fully acknowledges the extraordinary nature of the situation, including the fact that about 90,000 individuals have been detained and may be subject to prosecution. Instead, the report calls for the establishment of an independent review commission to assess all detentions carried out since the declaration of the state of emergency, to determine whether there is a lawful and individualized basis for continued detention, and to secure the release of those who are arbitrarily or unlawfully detained. It recommends that humanitarian factors be taken into account, meaning priority given to reviewing cases of the elderly, of children, of those infirm or especially vulnerable. At the international level, the report calls for support of accountability efforts through independent investigations, the use of universal jurisdiction where appropriate, and targeted sanctions against those responsible for grave abuses. I will end by making this central point. Our report concludes that the state of emergency has enabled an extreme concentration of power under which grave, widespread, and systematic human rights violations have been committed, giving rise to reasonable grounds to believe that these violations meet the legal threshold of crimes against humanity. The lesson learned is this: the duty to guarantee public security is critical, but cannot be achieved by committing crimes against humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Martinez-Fernandez.
Chairman Smith, Chairman McGovern, distinguished members, thank you for the invitation today to testify. Following decades of unchecked growth, Latin America's armed groups and narco-terrorist organizations have cornered an almost exclusive monopoly on the violation of human rights, political rights, and civil freedoms in the Western Hemisphere. That is not to mention the damage to hemispheric and U.S. national security caused by these organizations. In El Salvador, President Bukele's government has achieved dramatic gains against these violent gangs that once terrorized the Salvadoran people. In 2015, El Salvador held the grim distinction of being the most violent nation in the world, as narco-terrorist gangs like MS-13 and Barrio 18 operated with virtual impunity, terrorizing the population with extortion, sex trafficking, and heinous violence. When discussing the human rights situation in El Salvador and alleged violations of international law, we must recognize that the primary violators of civil, political, and human rights have overwhelmingly been El Salvador's narco-terrorist gangs. Indeed, international organizations have historically recognized this and often called on the government to take urgent action. For example, in 2016, one United Nations human rights expert reported deep shock at the forced recruitment of children as young as 9 by gangs in El Salvador, as well as the coercion of girls, adolescents, and women into sexual activity with gang members. The United Nations called these prima facie violations of human rights law, which obligated the government to take measures to eliminate these practices. By any fair assessment, El Salvador's human rights guarantees have been dramatically strengthened by the government's offensive against the narco-terrorist gang threat. The Bukele government's success against the gangs lies in part in treating these armed groups like MS-13 not simply as traditional law enforcement matters, but rather as the international narco-terrorist insurgencies that they are. The necessity of this framework shift in the government's approach to the gang threat has been borne out by the remarkable success of El Salvador's security strategy. On February 20th, 2025, the Trump administration also reinforced this dynamic and approach, designating MS-13 and 7 other armed groups as foreign terrorist organizations. El Salvador's days of helplessly facing a massive and destabilizing gang threat are not distant history. Indeed, many foreign academics and critics of the Bukele government have repeatedly warned that El Salvador's security gains are precarious. Just last year, Foreign Affairs magazine declared that, quote, the Salvadoran state's apparent strength sits atop an extremely fragile foundation. Given these dire warnings, it goes to reason that the government of El Salvador maintains emergency measures and high levels of vigilance against the possible resurgence of gang violence. Of course, most of these assessments of El Salvador's new security environment themselves have dubious footing and are clearly painted by political bias. However, we should recognize that there is nothing inherently permanent about the effects of the government's security measures. El Salvador's narco-terrorist threats were and in many ways remain extraordinary and continue to threaten the country. It is not difficult to imagine, for example, how the wholesale or imperfect unwinding of the Bukele government's security measures could lead to a rapid resurgence of gang activity. Major elements of El Salvador's narco-terrorist gangs remain highly active across the border in neighboring Central American countries and could easily accelerate the reestablishment of gang activity in El Salvador under certain conditions. Indeed, El Salvador's neighbors continue to contend with the extraordinary narco-terrorist threats. Earlier this year, in January, Guatemala faced a series of coordinated attacks against security targets by the Barrio 18 gang. Notably, Guatemala's President, Bernardo Arevalo, took many steps that mirror El Salvador's approach, including suspending certain civil rights and judicial rights under a state of emergency, launching mass arrests, and building a major new prison for gang members. Of course, a security campaign and offensive against the gangs as massive as that of El Salvador's is not free of failings. However, too many seek to exaggerate the nature and the scale of these concerns. Comparisons, for example, to North Korea completely fail to recognize the underlying realities and historical context and the current popularity of the Bukele administration, which is a clear vote of support from the people of El Salvador. Ending cooperation, cutting off ties, and other punitive measures from the United States towards El Salvador, as we have seen in the past, particularly under the Biden administration, have done nothing to change the engagement of the Salvadoran government with these threats. In fact, it has only served to undermine U.S. national security and our hemispheric security goals. Instead, we should work proactively to confront these narco-terrorist threats throughout the Western Hemisphere and build up institutions so that we can ensure that there is a broad-based approach to these dire national security threats that not only impact Latin America, but also the American people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have a lot of questions, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go last, and I'm going to yield to Mr. Smith to begin.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you all for your testimonies. Do appreciate it. Let me ask a couple of questions, and maybe just a yes or no would suffice. Do all of you agree or disagree that MS-13 ought to be a foreign terrorist organization and so designated?
Sorry, do you mind repeating the question?
Yes, the president has designated MS-13 as an FTO, a foreign terrorist organization, which gives enhanced capabilities to our government to try to interdict, understand their sources of funding, and how they are carrying out terrible misdeeds. Do you agree with that? Is MS-13 a foreign terrorist organization?
Sergio Arauz is a Salvadoran journalist. I'm afraid he doesn't have an opinion on that. Thank you.
No opinion? Okay.
Designating them as terrorists does not exclude them from the protection of the law.
So you agree they're terrorists and an FTO is warranted?
I think that's a matter of policy, but human rights still prevail.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I don't think I can make an opinion about things that are in U.S. law without studying it first. Our experience as a human rights organization is we've assisted thousands of victims of gang violence. We've won litigation at the Supreme Court of El Salvador that established the right of Salvadoran citizens to be protected from gang violence, and that produced a law that was actually signed in the first days of the Bukele regime to create a protection system. So I think the question is oriented to try and undermine our arguments that human rights violations are not acceptable in any context by trying to say that we are
That's not the question.
apologizing
The question
for
is,
organizations.
are they an FTO or not? Do you think that would help to mitigate the horrible cruelty that they have inflicted on so many people, including on trafficking victims? I mean, a little context. It took me 3 years to get the Obama administration to designate Boko Haram a foreign terrorist organization. 3 years. On the day I was marking up my bill to so designate, they did it. So, you know, it's another tool that we have to mitigate the horrendous damage and cruelty that are unleashed, including in my own state of New Jersey, by members of that gang, especially in the realm of human trafficking and narco-terrorism. It could be helpful, can't you see that? Yes, Human Rights Watch.
Mr. Co-Chair, they have certainly committed acts of terrorism. Now, I cannot comment on your question without, I'm a lawyer, so I cannot comment with your question before looking at the American law and assessing it with the facts. That's my job, to assess the law and the facts. They have certainly committed act of terrorism, but I don't have before me the requirements under U.S. law to designate them in this way.
If you could get back to us, I'd appreciate that answer. Yes.
Wonderful, thank you.
I agree with my colleague that, that the commission of terrorist acts may have been committed, but one would require the text of what qualifies as an FTO. What I would say is that we've seen an expanding definition of terrorists, not just in this country, but in other countries. And so it would be a matter of looking at that definition quite closely and applying it to the facts.
I believe they, by the same standards that we apply to other organizations historically as foreign terrorist organizations, gangs and narco-terrorist groups that have been designated over the past several months by the Trump administration absolutely fulfill those same standards and definitions. And furthermore, that is a necessary, as I testified, necessary shift in approach to the recognition of the realities of these organizations if we are going to effectively combat them. And that includes not only these designations, but the tools that they bring along with them, which we apply specifically to grave threats, which these organizations certainly meet those thresholds. That threshold.
Every year, I often have hearings on the Human Rights Report. The country reports on human rights practices. It's not within my jurisdiction anymore on the Foreign Affairs Committee. But El Salvador's country reports on human rights practices, as proffered by President Biden, and I have it right here, made the statement that the government took credible steps to identify and punish officials who may have considered human rights abuses. In like manner, the next year's Human Rights Report, which was for 2024, but it was issued by the Trump administration, so a different administration, made the exact same finding. The government took credible steps to identify and punish officials who committed human rights abuses. And I agree. Any official who tortures, commits horrible acts of sexual depravity on people, they ought to be not only dismissed, and there were large numbers of police officers that were disciplined and dismissed. They ought to be prosecuted without a doubt. Just because they commit horrible crimes doesn't mean that the police or anyone else should do likewise. But is the statement by President Biden and the statement by President Trump's country reports on human rights practices accurate or inaccurate? I'll read it again if you need it, because they had the exact language that the government took credible steps to identify and punish officials who committed human rights abuses. And that's Joe Biden.
Mr. Co-Chair, I think the statement issued by the State Department under Biden is inaccurate.
Not
and
good.
I said it's inaccurate, and I said so when the report was released. And I say so on the basis of the following. As far as we know, the only discernible progress in holding to account police and other officers responsible for human rights violations are 19 criminal investigations that are all pending. We don't know of any charges, indictments, or sentences against those 19 officers allegedly under investigation. There have been 66 administrative proceedings, and as far as we know, only 2 police officers have lost their jobs. That doesn't match the gravity of the human rights violations we have documented on the ground. I think the report by the State Department under Biden is inaccurate, and so is the latest report published more recently.
So when they said 12 of the police were dismissed, that was inaccurate in that report?
As far as we know, I think 2, the last figure I have is 2 that were released, but in any case, I don't think there is credible evidence of
I'm
progress
just going by
pending
the
those
report.
responsible to account.
The State Department's report.
Yeah.
Let me ask you if I could, when I began working on combating human trafficking in 1995, I did a child labor bill that passed the House, failed in the Senate, but we did get it passed in the year 2000. It's known as the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It took 3 years to get enacted, and what we found at first, it was very clear that organized crime was behind so much of this. The Russian mob, name the mob, they were making money hand over fist. They found that unlike drugs, which can be used once and then they're gone, a woman or a victim could be exploited over and over and over again and gain huge profits. What happened over the course of the years since enactment, it's been 26 years since that law became the law, the gangs in many places in the world, including in Central America, have arisen as the prime promoters of human trafficking. You know, I would note that right now, and this is again under the Biden administration, when the country reports, tier rankings came out on trafficking in the TIP report, the comment was made, and I was glad to see this, that the government of El Salvador does not fully meet the minimum standards. They're a tier 2 country for the elimination of trafficking, but is making significant efforts to do so. Now that came from the Biden administration, and you know, I had hearings on it, and you know, was glad to see that they're making progress. They're not there yet, but who's making progress? It's the government, according to the Biden administration. Are they wrong on that? Are they right on that? And again, the concern that I have had with these gangs is, in addition to all the exploitation and killing and murder and everything else they do, is that they are also the prime promoters in many countries of human trafficking, sex and labor trafficking. Your thoughts on any of that? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I think, of course, that is a tremendous problem, an absolute tremendous problem. I come from the field of international criminal law, so what I talked about was crimes against humanity. And that requires, as I mentioned, that the attack be against civilians. If you were to use that lens, civilians mean anyone who's not a combatant, who's not a fighter. So, and the jurisprudence of the international criminal tribunals is quite clear on this. So long as there's no armed conflict, all persons targeted are considered civilians, even if they have committed criminal acts. And you can see this by way of example in the case against the former president of the Philippines, Duterte, right? In that case, he is now before the ICC on a case in which he's accused of murders in the context of his war against drugs, against drug gangs, right? But again, while the problem is real, trafficking and drug violence and gang violence is real, it cannot be solved at the cost of crimes against humanity. It cannot be solved, and we cannot automatically look at those members as anything but civilians, and we need to treat them as civilians. Otherwise, the organized cumulative pattern of conduct of violence that you've heard from my colleagues here amounts to crimes against humanity, amounts to a pattern of cumulative violence organized against civilians.
Okay, I do have some additional questions, but we have quite a roster of members, so I'll wait for the second round.
Mr. Vargas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. First of all, I want to thank both of the co-chairs. I think that they have a long history of working for human rights and have been very successful at it from different approaches, but I appreciate that very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to sit with you today. It's an honor. Thank you. I do have some experience in El Salvador, as I said earlier. I was a Jesuit for part of my life. I was a novitiate, then a scholastic, and then a regent. I did have an opportunity to live in Chalatenango during the war, a very difficult time. The first word that I really learned there was impunity. Impunity. That unfortunately the government, the death squads worked with impunity, which meant really there was no punishment for evil doing, for crimes. And unfortunately it seems that it is sliding back into that. I don't think there's any doubt that gangs are bad. And I don't think anybody here said that they were good. In fact, just the opposite. I think they were creating a real security issue. There's no problem about that. There's no issue. I mean, no discussion that anyone would say, no, they were great. No, I think that they were terrible. And I do think that they created a really difficult security situation, a horrible situation for regular citizens. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, I think that someone said it well, you know, we can't have a state that's run by the gangs, and we can't have a state that's run by a dictator that has impunity, or that his government has impunity. I think people have been arrested, detained, without any just cause and have no way to get justice. I think that is ultimately a crime against humanity. I think that the document, the report says that, and I think you're right. So there has to be some balance when, in fact, you can get to these gangs to make sure that they don't run the country, they don't commit the type of crimes that they were committing, but at the same time in some way that is respectful of the rule of law. And I'd like to ask about that, because I think that's what we ultimately want to get to. We want to get to a situation where the country is secure and safe, but at the same time that the liberties, the human rights that people have are not trampled upon. What about this commission? Some oversight. I think that's the problem. I remember with impunity, when we were there and we saw lots of people get killed, and I buried lots of people as a Jesuit, there was never any recourse. You know, there were nice people in the United States and other people that, that cared, but there was really no recourse till after the war. So what about what is wrong with having an independent commission? Take a look at this. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I think that that's right, that there could be that intermediary step even now, and there are often cited examples from other parts of the region, including from Peru in the 1990s during the Fujimori government's response to terrorism by groups such as the Shining Path. So in that context, like here, there was emergency legislation, special courts that led to wrongful prosecution and imprisonment of hundreds of people accused of terrorism. In response to growing concerns like the ones we've talked about today, Peru established a special commission to review cases of individuals who had been unfairly processed or convicted under those emergency laws. And where the commission concluded there was reasonable grounds to believe there was no reasonable evidence of involvement in terrorism, it could recommend pardons or grants of clemency to the president. While that mechanism was imperfect and it was rightly criticized as not amounting to full innocence or reparations, and of course individuals with access or resources to legal assistance may have been better positioned to benefit from the process, it nevertheless resulted in the release of a significant number of people who had been unjustly detained. So the lesson, I think, from Peru is not that review mechanisms are a panacea, but they are and can play an important corrective role even after prolonged emergency measures, if they're independent, transparent, adequately resourced, and empowered to conduct individualized review of evidence.
And it seems like a reasonable thing. It just, you do have to have some mechanism to review this. You have to have some mechanism that works. You said that the one that was used was imperfect. There is a way to improve it. But there cannot be impunity. You cannot just arrest people, have them sit at CCOT, not get their opportunity to try their case. I mean, instead, not even be charged. Oftentimes, they're just there. They're detained, and he said it's not just gang members, unfortunately, it's everybody. I mean, you do get people who are reporters, you get people who are human rights advocates, you get all these people that criticize the government, and once they do that, then they become targets. They have to have some ability to defend themselves in a court of law or in some process that gives them an opportunity to have some rights. Is there anyone else that wants to comment on that?
I can help
Sí, cómo no.
translate Sergio's.
Gracias, congresistas. Justamente se trata de esto, el debate, o lo que nosotros alegamos, o al menos en la Asociación de Periodistas del Salvador alegamos. Yo no estoy en contra de que los pandilleros estén en la cárcel, ni que no se persiga a los pandilleros.
This is exactly what the discussion is about. He's not as the Journalist Association, President of Journalist Association of Salvador, a journalist in exile currently. He's not advocating for the release of gang members.
El problema es que capturan a muchas personas que piensan distinto, por pensar distinto están capturando a campesinos, a líderes sindicales, a periodistas y activistas de derechos humanos, y hay muchos casos.
The problem is that many people are being captured during this wave of repression, including human rights defenders, journalists, union members, and civic leaders.
Y solo para aclarar, los periodistas no estamos exentos de cumplir la ley y de los juicios que tengamos que rendir ante el Estado, pero queremos que los juicios sean justos, que las reglas sean claras y que tengamos derecho a un debido proceso. O sea, nos está persiguiendo por pensar distinto.
Journalists are not subject to different system or rights. There's the same rule of law, the same laws, but what they're asking is exactly that, for that to be applied to them, not to be prosecuted because they have different opinion or they have different take or because of their investigations.
Thank you.
Can I add something?
Yes.
Thank you so much. One thing that I would like to add is that this is not just an opportunity for those victims of the system that have been swept up under this state of exception, but also for El Salvador and for the government of Bukele to correct course on all the human rights violations. So it is really a good opportunity to create a commission of international and national experts to review these cases of detention. Most of them, not to say all of them, are in pretrial detention. There are no convictions. And as we mentioned during the panel, they are absolutely cut off of any communication with their lawyers and families. They have no right to defense. And they're virtually in a situation of enforced disappearance. So there have been proposals already, and I think that we could submit those in writing, of creating a commission of 4 or 5 international and national experts in different fields that could help the judicial system in El Salvador to review those cases and to understand the technical challenges that they have at the moment with the amount of arrests, the detentions, and cases that they have at the moment. So that would be the idea, as Susana said, taking into account comparative experiences from other countries in the region.
Thank you, and I hope you do put it in writing. I think that would be very helpful. And again, to the co-chair, I thank you very much. I know that people come from different perspectives of this, but I appreciate very much you putting the focus on it and all the attention that it deserves. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Chair recognizes Ms. Omar.
I also want to start by thanking the co-chairs for holding this hearing and for always putting emphasis on the protection of human rights. As we've heard today, the state of exception in El Salvador has resulted in a systematic denial of human rights and constitutional protections for the Salvadorian people. Thousands of people have been subject to arbitrary arrests, forced disappearances, torture, denial of due process, acts very well that might constitute crimes against humanity, as was mentioned. Yet there's been no justice for these victims. I'm particularly struck by the disturbing parallel to the United States in what we're hearing today. The use of quotas that incentivize arbitrary arrests, rates that disproportionately target marginalized communities, prejudgment of detainees based on appearances, arbitrary detention, and abject failure to follow judicial orders. There is no acceptable justification for the violation of these fundamental rights in El Salvador, in the United States, or anywhere in the world. Ironically, the very rationalization that the Trump administration has given for violating Americans' rights, sensationalists and false claims about illegal immigrants has contributed to U.S. support for Bukele's administration and its abuses in El Salvador. Last year, the United States sent thousands of detainees to El Salvador prisons where they were subject to inhumane conditions and torture. In exchange, the United States returned at least one MS-13 gang member who faced criminal charges in the United States to El Salvador, reportedly because President Bukele feared the gang member would reveal details of negotiations between MS-13 and his administration. This action undermines our own justice system to appease a leader who is systematically repressing, killing, and torturing his own people. This cannot stand. The erosion of democracy anywhere affects us all. Mr. Papier, you described systematic violations against individuals deported by the United States and urged Congress to end U.S. support for the Bukele administration. Can you speak in more detail on how U.S. policy has empowered Bukele?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Let me start with the cooperation in terms of deportations to CICOT. I think the fact that American taxpayers' money, $5 million, were sent to El Salvador to pay for what was called the housing of these detainees, who were then tortured systematically, in some cases sexually abused, is incredibly worrisome. And that requires action by Congress to make sure that these loopholes are not used when the people are being deported, especially when third country nationals are being sent to countries they have no connection with and where they're subject to abuses as it occurred in this case in Sikot. Secondly, I think the political support that the Trump administration has provided to President Bukele has emboldened his administration to take steps that run counter to basic human rights obligations. One example is the following. In the past, President Bukele was considering the idea of passing a foreign agents law. Mr. Arauz mentioned this foreign agent law, which is highly restrictive of the work of civil society and independent journalists. It's, by the way, very similar to the legislation in Nicaragua. President Bukele had not passed this law, in part because of pressure from other governments not to pass it, because they were trying to protect the civic space in the country. But after President Trump took office, he decided to pass the law. And I don't think that is a coincidence. I think that has to do with feeling emboldened by the political support he's receiving from Washington.
Thank you. Ms. Sakota, as Representative Vargas mentioned, El Salvador has gone through a civil war. There's been a lot of history of human rights violations, and despite continued advocacy around the world for there to be accountability, there's been little in the past. What do you say are the challenges for having that accountability to the abuses?
Thank you for the question. I think the challenges are not maybe unique to El Salvador. I think when there is a system where due process and basic fundamental rights are threatened, that at home the process becomes difficult. The process of accountability becomes difficult, which is, I think, why this idea of a commission, perhaps with some international support, could begin the process of individualized review that itself isn't full accountability, but is a step in that direction. I think what my colleague said with respect to the answer to your last question, how has this emboldened the current administration? Just yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, there was a new life imprisonment constitutional reform signed into law that allows life imprisonment for minors as young as 12 years old, convicted of crimes including homicide, rape, and gang membership. It authorizes the transfer of convicted minors to adult prison facilities, a move strongly criticized by many of us. And as our reports and others have just documented today, the arrests are based sometimes on subjective factors like appearance, like tattoos, like social economic status. What this means is that 12-year-olds could face life imprisonment based on suspicion rather than solid evidence right now, and that's a problem.
I appreciate that. And you mentioned the Philippines, Peru, other places where there have been accountability, but in a lot of the cases around the world where we see that kind of justice take place, it's oftentimes because the home country comes to terms with what has taken place and wants that accountability. Do you see that ever happening in El Salvador?
It's a very good question. I think if we zoom back and we look at different places even in the region, think about Colombia, for instance, 5+ decades of civil war. At some point in 2016, there were a peace accord, and eventually that set up a transitional justice mechanism by which some of the crimes committed during the war have received attention through a process primarily of encouraging those perpetrators of international crimes to come forward and acknowledge their crimes, and if they don't, then be subject to criminal prosecution. There are problems with this system. It's not perfect, but there are innovative ways, particularly after a transition, that can be used to hold perpetrators accountable.
Thank you. Mr. Bullock, you've spoken about your experience in being targeted by Pegasus spyware. Since then, the Trump administration has significantly shifted U.S. policy towards spyware, including the incorporating it into ISIS toolbox. Now, there are reports that the NSO group whose software was used to hack your phone and the phones of many of your colleagues is going to be delisted by the Trump administration. Can you tell us, based on your experience, what the implications are for human rights organizations if the NSO group were to be delisted?
Together with a group of journalists, my phone was infected with Pegasus software. The impact on me personally was a message that the state of El Salvador, because we were informed that the clients of NSO are strictly state actors, and the knowledge of that a state, as a part of a policy, invests money into spying on my personal communications, it had a huge impact in my understanding of freedoms and the freedoms that me and my colleagues had as human rights defenders. But I also think that those types of tools are used to send a broader message to the population, that they should be careful what they say. Our experience with Pegasus was now a couple of years ago, but that experience of the restriction of freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of association has now been extended to the entirety of the Salvadoran population. There are important testimonies, for example, of medical personnel who fear making public their own technical criteria as physicians if it would be uncomfortable for the regime. And so what the story, I think, is that the Pegasus software reflects that the loss of rights of one group sooner or later will affect the entirety of the society.
Thank you. And Mr. Aruz, I know that you and your colleagues at El Paso were also impacted, but as you answer about your experience, I also want to ask if you think that your attack had to do with the fact that you were reporting on the relationship between Bukele and MS-13 gangs.
El Instituto Knight de la Universidad de Columbia nos está representando a un grupo de periodistas del Faro en una corte de California, en la que estamos pidiendo o exigiendo saber si extrajeron archivos de nuestros teléfonos, qué archivos extrajeron, por qué estuvieron monitoreándonos en los momentos en que mi periódico y un grupo de periodistas, incluyéndome, estábamos investigando los pactos del presidente Bukele con las pandillas. Eso fue antes del régimen de excepción.
Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University is working with El Faro in Californian courts to ask it for a series of things regarding NSO's responsibility, and specifically the Bukele's government, on what archives or files or information was extracted from their phones, why that happened, what was the intention, and at that time, that this predates the state of exception, they were investigating the relation or the discussions, or, sorry, ¿cómo describirías tú la relación entre Bukele y las gangs? ¿Negociaciones? The negotiations, what Faro described as negotiations between Bukele administration and the gangs.
Hace unos días, el Faro, en colaboración con PBS y el programa Frontline, publicamos un extenso documental sobre los distintos pactos del gobierno Bukele con las pandillas de El Salvador, incluida la MS-13. Hay pruebas que vienen del mismo gobierno, documentos oficiales del mismo gobierno Bukele, y nosotros sospechamos que nos han perseguido a los periodistas del Faro y a otros colegas de El Salvador por saber quiénes son nuestras fuentes justamente. Creemos que ese es el motivo principal. Sin embargo, por eso es que estamos exigiendo toda la información a NS Group que se llevaron de nuestros teléfonos, que nos monitorearon y que tienen.
In a documentary just released with PBS and made from PBS and El Faro, They just exposed a series of negotiations between gangs and Bukele, including MS-13, and they have showed evidence, including from government sources. They're suspicious they've been prosecuted because of that work and because they want to know who are these sources and what is the documents they have.
And then, I mean, lastly, if I can just ask you, one of the co-chairs said it is safe to live in Bukele's El Salvador. You are living in exile, so it is safe to say it wasn't safe for you?
Yes. Yo salí de El Salvador 2 noches después de la captura de Ruth López. Recibí una llamada de fuentes del gobierno de El Salvador en la que me persuadieron de que saliera lo más rápido posible. En el mes de mayo capturaron a media decena de activistas y defensores de derechos humanos, incluyendo a Ruth. Yo salí el 21 de mayo y ahora vivo en México.
He left Salvador a year ago, May 21st last year, 2 days after Ruth Lopez was captured, and he was persuaded by sources that he had to leave for his own security, and he's been in exile since then. A dozen of people were captured in the following days. As a reminder, in his testimony, APES has documented at least 53 journalists living in exile. There are hundreds of human rights activists, defenders, lawyers also in exile. There are no exact numbers that we know. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Representative Dexter.
Thank you to the co-chairs McGovern and Smith for holding this critical hearing, and I'm deeply grateful to the witnesses for making your time and your experiences available to us today. My constituents, including members of the Portland Central American Solidarity Committee, have been very clear in their concern for the people of El Salvador. There is deep care in our community for protecting human rights at home and abroad, and that commitment guides my participation today in this conversation. Nearly a year ago, almost exactly, I traveled to El Salvador to demand due process for Kilmar Abrego Garcia. That trip was driven by urgent concerns from my constituents about the conditions in Salvadoran prisons and the lack of transparency and due process surrounding the transfer of these individuals. What I learned from advocates on the ground in El Salvador then helped me understand the situation we are facing here in the United States. That experience and insight has shaped how I've met my work here. It reinforced my responsibility to meet moments of human rights and due process violations with urgency and courage, as you all have so clearly exhibited. It also strengthened my commitment to keep pressure on for real accountability and outcomes. So with that in mind, as a mother and a physician, I'm deeply concerned about the impact of detention conditions, especially on children. And for whoever would like to address this, and Ms. Sakudo, I imagine, considering what you just shared, this may be appropriate for you, but I'd appreciate hearing about the more than 3,000 children who have been detained in El Salvador, what they're experiencing in adult prisons, and what can we do to help better protect them? And anyone can answer, but
I'm happy to answer. I defer to my colleagues doing research on the ground on those issues. I've relied on their documentation along with other sources for our report, so I defer to colleagues.
Congresswoman, thank you for your question. We published in July 2024 a comprehensive report about the children in prison in El Salvador as a result of the state of emergency. At the time, the information we had is that 3,300 children had been detained. This includes boys and girls as young as 12 years old. We documented that they were subject to arbitrary detention, in many cases detained for no reason whatsoever. We documented in several cases that they were tortured, including with mock executions and with beatings. We documented these conditions in prisons like El Espino and the girls' prison known as El Femenino. And we also documented several cases of due process violations, namely that many of them were coerced to plead guilty in group settings when they said they had no connection whatsoever to gangs, but they were coerced to plead guilty so that they could get a shorter sentence and go back to see. As they said, I plead guilty because I want to see my mother. We had reports of some cases of sexual violence against these children, and the conditions in detention, I would say, were inhumane, with diseases being propagated in these detention facilities. And since we published the report, there have been some very worrisome legislative developments. One of them is a law passed that allows authorities to transfer children to adult facilities, even if they're supposedly required to hold them in separate cells. They will be, under the same guards that are in charge of adult facilities in El Salvador. And secondly, today, the Salvadorian government published a new piece of legislation that allows for life imprisonment for children as young as 12. The legislation, as UNICEF has noted, violates the obligations of El Salvador and under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and only allows these cases to be reviewed after children have served a sentence of 25 years.
I might just add that all of what you heard is, of course, contrary to basic human rights standards applicable to children.
Of course. All right. I am going to move on, though I'm almost revolted to the level of wanting to just say, if there's anything we can do to raise awareness, it is definitely something that I would be happy to partner with. Mr. Bullock.
Yeah, in relation to the treatment of children in detention, and also the question about accountability in the justice system, our legal team represented a group of Honduran children who were arrested while eating lunch under a mango tree after they were working in the morning in a field in Honduras, and they crossed the border and were. The trial, the trial lasted about a half an hour. Our team was unable to present exculpatory evidence, and they were convicted largely on the testimony of the arresting officers, that they were in a place known to be a place met by gangs, and they were sentenced. They were sentenced for the reforms to the Constitution. For me, it's striking to understand that the terminology of the Constitution that was adjusted. Previously, the Salvadoran Constitution said that the purpose of the criminal justice system is correction and rehabilitation, and specifically said not extermination of the person. The reform to the criminal code codifies what's the practice that you've heard today in these testimonies, that the prison system in El Salvador is not a place anymore for correction, compliance, or completing sentences or rehabilitation, rather permanent incarceration and punishment, extermination of the person. And on a personal level, we've debated today sort of the brutality of the gangs. How I administered safe houses and personally escorted family members of victims of sexual slavery by the gangs to humanitarian protection outside of the country. We know that drama. But the actions of a state shouldn't be compared to the actions of a criminal actor. And the idea of codifying in the Constitution that the prison system is for the extermination of people, that's the basis for the atrocities that we're describing today. Again, on a personal level, when I listened to testimonies of people who were witnesses to torture and sexual abuse of children in the prisons, that was the end of the debate between whether there's a legitimacy around the security policy or not. A security policy predicated on the torture and sexual abuse of children is not a legitimate security policy, or one that should be celebrated.
Definitely agree with that. Mr. Papier, Salvadoran members of my community have raised concerns about what Salvadoran immigrants may face if they are deported to El Salvador while the state exception is in place. Human Rights Watch has reported that El Salvador has disappeared individuals who have been deported from the United States. Can you elaborate on what your organization is seeing and what must be done to ensure that if someone is deported to El Salvador, that their rights, as much as they are available, can be granted?
Thank you for that question. As far as we know, in 2025, 9,000 Salvadorians were deported back to El Salvador. The vast majority of them had no criminal records in the United States. We have documented in particular 20 cases where the men, in all cases men deported to El Salvador, were immediately transferred to a prison, and their relatives tell us that they are not aware of the whereabouts of of these men, why they're being held, what crimes they're being accused of. Essentially, what we documented is that these men have been subject to enforced disappearance under international human rights law. In a few cases, they were able to learn their whereabouts a few months later, thanks to litigation before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. But obviously, no one should be required to litigate before a regional human rights system to learn where their loved ones are being held in prison. We know that some are being held in the Santa Ana prison and some are being held in COMPLICIT. We don't know what these men are being accused of. They have not been presented or taken before a judge, and they have no legal recourse whatsoever.
Can I add something to that? Thank you so much. I just want to reiterate that from the 280 deportees to El Salvador between March and April, in those flights that went from the US to El Salvador, 252 Venezuelans were released. But they were released because of political negotiations between the United States and Venezuela. At no time were they able to see a judge. At no time did they have due process. At no time did they have their right to defense. Now there are at least 36 Salvadorans that continue to be held at COMPLICIT after being deported from the US to El Salvador. And this is extremely important because now we have real accounts of what happened to Venezuelans who were deported from the US to El Salvador. And we're talking about torture and grave human rights violations. So now we can only imagine what those Salvadoran nationals are going through. We cannot say for sure that they are at COMPLICIT. These are presumptions. This is the same thing that happened with Venezuelans. Nor the US nor El Salvador ever gave official acknowledgement that these migrants were placed at COMPLICIT. The only reason why the families and their lawyers knew that they were placed at COMPLICIT was because of independent media and the work of local NGOs. There is a complete lack of transparency. They have no communication with their family members. They have no communication with their lawyers, no access to a lawyer, no access to a judge, no due process, no presumption of innocence. Thank you.
Thank you. In the interest of being collaborative with my colleagues, I'll yield. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ivey. I think there's one thing we could all agree on, and that is that this sound system is lousy. But in any event, I yield to Mr. Ivey.
Well, thank you to both of the chairs and to the Lantos group for putting this together, and to my colleagues, but especially to the witnesses. It's hard to know where to start with this. I don't come to this with international background. I was a local prosecutor. I was elected here in Prince George's County in 2002. We had and continue to have a large population from El Salvador, Central America, other countries as well. But that's how I got to know about MS-13. And I found a couple of things. One was that, yes, it was a very violent and dangerous gang. We were also able to address that with legitimate and straightforward prosecutions using basic standards of due process and the like. We had a scenario where we did, Maryland doesn't have a RICO statute, so I had to team up with the U.S. Attorney of Maryland, who at that time was Rod Rosenstein, the guy that later became the acting Attorney General under the President Trump in the first term. And we did a RICO prosecution, locked out 25 of the leaders of MS-13 at that time. When I got elected to Congress, one of the first trips I made was to El Salvador, in part because I have such a large population, and we had a lot of people who were talking about their experiences and their relationships and with their families and the like, the remittances issues and all of that. So I said, well, let me go see what's going on down there. But in preparing for the trip, I asked about what's the nature of the governance down there, and Bukele came up, and I heard about the mass detentions and COMPLICIT and all of that. So I actually reached out to the Department of Justice. I'd been in the Department of Justice before I was a local prosecutor. And I said, would it be okay if I went down there? Because I know we have programs where we'll send prosecutors down to help train judges, to help train lawyers, to provide resources and funding, to help put levels of due process in place. Because what we were hearing and what I've heard today, and what I heard while I was down there, was they just lock people up. And they don't get any kind of pretrial screening, as you mentioned. There's pretrial detained, but no notice about what the charges might be, when they might have a court date, no access to counsel, any of that. And so I proposed that to high-level officials in Bukele's administration, and they all refused to do it. They all said no. So to the extent there's a conversation about some kind of international group to take a look at what's going on, maybe provide external oversight with respect to that, I think it makes total sense, because it's clear to me that they know they're locking up people who have no criminal offenses to their background. They don't want to bother screening through it. I don't know if that's because they don't want to admit that they've been locking up people who haven't committed any kind of crime or not, but whatever the reasoning is, the reasoning's wrong. So I would support any kind of effort to provide any kind of external review of that, or for that matter, if the Bukele administration got due process inspiration and decided to take us up on the Department of Justice, although our Department of Justice isn't really kind of a beacon of freedom right now, I would say. But anything we can do to help to address that, I would be strongly in favor of. With respect to what's going on right now, Kilmar Abrego Garcia lives in my district. He's one of my constituents. And so when I went down there the second time back in, I guess it was last May, it was to go actually try and visit him. Senator Van Hollen had a chance to see him, and in the wake of his visit, he was moved from CCOT to, is it St. Anna? Okay. And that's where I tried to go to see him. They wouldn't let me in, even though I told them I was going to go and the like. But, you know, it's clear that they continue to do things that I think are flagrantly illegal. The relationship between what El Salvador is doing in the United States is deeply disturbing to me. The contract that they entered into with the United States of America to detain people like Kilmar, who were facing no criminal charges. The Venezuelans that you mentioned hadn't been charged with, I think the vast majority of them hadn't been charged with any kind of crime anywhere, whether it's the United States, El Salvador, or Venezuela. Yet sending them to CCOT was essentially a life sentence, because they hadn't been convicted or sentenced to any kind of time in jail. They could have been permanently detained there. And to the best of our knowledge, there are people there now who are being indefinitely detained and imprisoned. So I hope that we can find ways to try and address that. We had the push to try and get the actual agreement between the United States and El Salvador. I don't know if we've ever gotten wind of that. I heard that it was a $5 million payment that the United States made to El Salvador, but does anybody know if we've actually had the chance to get access to whatever that agreement was? Anybody on the panel?
I'm just going to say that on March 26, a coalition of human rights organizations representing 18 victims, Venezuelan victims, we presented a petition before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and one of our petitions is to make that agreement public. The agreement has not been made public, and we do not understand why. If it's a matter of national security concerns, our opinion is that it has to be made public. To us, as American citizens and as taxpayers, we want to understand why our money is going to paying atrocities like the ones happening in detention centers in El Salvador. From our understanding and the information that we have, there was a payment of $4.76 million US, with total annual payments reportedly ranging from $6 to $50 million, according to media reports, but the lack of transparency does not allow us to say that these are the final numbers. So just the same thing as those who were deported and those who remain at COMPLICIT and those who were released, it's all approximately, right? We cannot talk about exact numbers.
Fair enough. And the other aspect of concern with respect to that was with respect to Kilmar, when we were demanding that he be returned to the United States, both sides were saying they didn't have the ability to send him back. under this agreement, which absolutely makes no sense. The point I made at the time and will continue to make now is if we pay to have an arrangement to have someone detained in a country, President Trump could have just had him brought back. Instead, they had to do this charade where they charged him with other federal crimes and then brought him back under that scenario, but we'll see how that plays out. I had a question for you all, too. There's a couple of you all, familiar faces I see on the panel. Glad that you're able to come and join us today and bring the expertise and experience. I've heard about, I think from you, this deal that was made with respect to, as the Eastern District of New York, these are the gang members who were about to be prosecuted, MS-13 gang leaders were about to be prosecuted in New York, and then there was a request by Mr. Bukele to have, I think, one or two of them sent back to El Salvador. One was sent back before he was tried, and this was over the objection of, I think, the prosecutors who'd been handling the case. They'd spent years putting this case together. And these weren't just mid-level guys. These are very high-level MS-13 officials with, killings to their names and the like. There was a request for the second one. I think he objected because he said, I'd rather stay in the United States and stand trial than go back there because I don't know what's awaiting for me there. What, if you know, would be the update on what happened with that? I think that was last summer, if I recall correctly. Have you heard any things with respect to what happened to the two people who were sent back to El Salvador and what's happened with those trials?
Yeah, I'll let Sergio talk more in depth about the reporting that El Faro has done on that. As a human rights defender, as I said earlier, I don't know if I can make a determination about the terrorist designation of the Mara Salvatrucha in the United States, but prosecutors from the Eastern District of New York did make that determination and were accusing the key leadership of the Mara Salvatrucha of narco-terrorism. And what's come out, it's written also in the indictment and some of the official documentation of the federal prosecutors in the Eastern District, that part of that indictment is a relationship that the Bukele regime sustained with the Mara Salvatrucha to create, in the first few years of his administration, the perception of reduced homicide rates in exchange for political benefits to the Bukele administration and his political party. This underpins one of the key concerns that we're trying to raise today is while the regime itself celebrates its model and invests millions of dollars to promote it around the region as a model for security, in two stages it was predicated on criminality. And in the first one, a pact with gangs, and in the second one, as you've heard today, potentially policies that amount to crimes against humanity. And so I think it's important for the policy to be analyzed in that context, in that light. I'll let Sergio talk more about the nature of the agreement, but I think it's important maybe in subsequent hearings to be able to learn more about the investigations by federal prosecutors that were successful investigations in terms of building accountability for a dangerous criminal structure that operated transnationally, and the dealings between Bukele and the U.S. government more recently has undermined those successful efforts at law enforcement.
And before I yield back, if we could allow the last witness to please give us your thoughts.
Thank you. El Faro y ProPublica en Estados Unidos y PBS también tiene reportes de fuentes oficiales, de documentos que están en Estados Unidos, que hubo una petición expresa del gobierno de El Salvador a través de un familiar del presidente, el hermano, en la que se le pidió el regreso de líderes pandilleros, la Ranfla Nacional, que están cumpliendo penas o que están en procesos legales acá, regresarlos a El Salvador.
Let me go with this, thank you. El Faro, in collaboration with ProPublica and PBS, has shown official sources of a communication from Bukele's government to here in the U.S. requesting the release of specific gang members.
El líder pandillero que llegó a El Salvador junto con los venezolanos a Secot se llama César Larios, el Greñas. Él pertenece a una de las a la estructura principal, a la jerarquía, y es una de las personas que pidió expresamente el gobierno de El Salvador a la administración Trump que regresara.
One of those people specifically they requested to be sent back to El Salvador was Cesar Larios, sitting high in the hierarchies of these gangs, and it was requested specifically to the Trump administration to be sent back to El Salvador.
Well, I thank you for your testimony, and I appreciate your comments. I'm going to yield back. I do want to thank the gentleman from the Heritage Foundation. I apologize. I would love to engage you in a conversation. Really, I appreciate your comments about not having a double standard. I do want to tease out at some point. We don't have time to do it right now, but you know what your take is on some basic human rights, legal rights that could be established in El Salvador under the Bukele regime, recognizing that MS-13 is a dangerous organization, whether you define them as terrorist or not, but that maybe there are things that could be put in place there and absolutely need to be in place here in the United States. So I appreciate you all coming, and I'll yield back and thank the chairs again.
No, I thank you. I thank you all for your questions. I have a few. Let me just say, I've been following El Salvador since I was a congressional aide in the early 1980s. That's like a long time, you know, and it's frustrating and it's sad because I think the Salvadoran people deserve a hell of a lot better than they've gotten, you know, from their government in the 80s and 90s and up to current day, and quite frankly, they deserve a hell of a lot better from our country. You know, we all agree that gang violence is a horrific condition that people have to deal with, and we all favor, you know, basic laws and rules and regulations, you know, that protect people. There's no question about that. There's no controversy about that. But I think no matter how you look at it, I mean, there are things happening in El Salvador today that, no matter how you view it, they definitely fall into the category of human rights violations. You know, where people's human rights and civil liberties are being violated. There's no question about that. And I worry that Bukele has no incentive, or his government has no incentive, based on the behavior of the United States government, to change any of that. I mean, he can do whatever the hell he wants to do, and there's no real pushback. You know, when confronted with evidence of human rights abuses, I mean, defenders of the Salvadoran government either claim reductions in gang violence, you know, cite the popularity of President Bukele, you know, or just basically deny that there are any abuses. I mean, we're hearing from our friend, Mr. Arroz, who's a journalist who can no longer operate safely in El Salvador. He is one of countless journalists who have fled. I think the last time I was in El Salvador was in 2024. I visited Mr. Bullock at Cristasol, and he no longer can operate in El Salvador. Almost everybody that I have dealt with over the years who is either a journalist or a human rights defender has been forced to leave. They didn't want to leave, but they were forced to leave. They were to protect their own lives and the lives of those who are parts of their organizations or who they work with. I mean, that's just a fact. There's no denying that. But I just want to ask initially just some basic questions, just to set the record straight. And these are simple yes or no answers. And I understand if you can't answer certain questions because of, you know, you're a journalist. But let me just ask. In January, President Bukele said, and I'm quoting him, "Our war against gangs did not have a single civilian casualty." End of quote. I mean, yes or no, is that, do you believe that that's an accurate statement?
Es mentira. Hay muchos civiles que han sido capturados en nombre de la guerra contra las pandillas, y eso es justamente lo que queremos que se detenga.
It is a lie. There's been countless or many civilians that have been captured as part of this current system.
Ms. Roby?
That would be an incorrect statement.
Mr. Bullock?
It's inaccurate. Just in the last week, 2 people mentioned deaths that happened to people who were detained in El Salvador in the last year.
to me.
Mr. Papier?
That's certainly inaccurate, Congressman.
Mr. Sakuto?
Agreed, inaccurate.
Mr. Martinez-Fernandez?
I'm not familiar with the context of the statement, but I would imagine that there were individuals who, as for decades, El Salvador has faced this criminal narco-terrorist violence, who were adversely impacted during this operation and these ongoing security challenges.
Right. Well, from 2019 to 2023, the State Department's annual human rights reports on El Salvador documented human rights abuses by Salvadoran security forces and in Salvadoran prisons. The report for 2024, however, released in August of 2025, claimed there were, and I'm quoting from the report, no credible reports of significant human rights abuses in El Salvador. Mr. Martinez-Fernandez, do you agree with that? I mean, is that an accurate statement?
I have no particular reason to information that contravenes the conclusions that the State Department found. I will say that as we've heard about previous years' findings, the Biden administration found substantial efforts that were taken towards addressing these issues. And I would say that also there's a lot of, the question of credibility of some of these accusations is very much an issue. I think there's a lot of words and accusations that are thrown around in the context of El Salvador and the Bukele administration, and some of those here today as well, which I do think very much stretch the definition of credibility. And in that context, comparing, for example, El Salvador to North Korea, or claiming that there's an effort to exterminate the population is not credible, and I think that throws into question the credibility of broader human rights concerns that may be legitimate.
Let me say, I'm not here to defend Joe Biden. I mean, my critique of Joe Biden, you know, and by the way, some of his predecessors, was Latin America became an afterthought in their foreign policy approaches. I mean, quite frankly, you know, I mean, we should have been more engaged in El Salvador after the war ended than we were, and more interested in, you know, supporting that country, and we walked away from it, and then you saw a proliferation of gangs, and now we are where we are right now. But it's just hard for me to believe that you could say, anyone could say that there, you know, that there are no credible reports of significant human rights abuses in El Salvador. Every human rights organization that I have talked to that monitors what happens in El Salvador, the church, you know, the UCA. I mean, I go right down the list of all the organizations and groups that monitor. I mean, they talk about this. They talk about human rights. So when we put in our State Department report statements like that, it's either a shocking, you know, ignorance of what the reality is, or it's intentional. And if it's intentional, that is even more troublesome, because it makes it seem like, you know, we're willing to just toss human rights aside because we like the guy who's running the country right now. You know, let me go down the line here.
Thank you for the question. I think based on our investigation, in addition to the reports from organizations of representatives sitting here on the panel, we looked at official documents and public statements by high-level authorities, including social media posts by those authorities in assessing the evidence. We looked at hearings and reports of international and human rights bodies such as the Inter-American System, as well as this commission. We looked at press reports, and crucially, we had direct testimonies from victims, family members, and civil society actors collected in both face-to-face meetings and virtually. So based on that documentation, that seems wrong.
Mr. Papier?
Thank you, Congressman. Well, that's the reference in the latest report on human rights practice in El Salvador is certainly inaccurate, and not only that, it contradicts sentences a few paragraphs down where they mention reports about extrajudicial execution and other abuses. So I'd say it's very poorly edited and it's inaccurate, and that's very unfortunate, because the State Department's report on human rights practices is an important document that has been, you know, used by people around the world to assess the human rights conditions in many countries. And it's unfortunate that these efforts to whitewash the record of the Bukele administration undermine the credibility of that report.
Mr. Bullock?
Yeah, it's inaccurate and contradicts briefings and concrete evidence that we've presented to the State Department over the years. I think also would welcome an opportunity to provide a briefing to the Heritage Foundation about the substantial body of evidence that there are, that exists about torture, deaths in prison, arbitrary detentions. Before we conclude that those are, they lack credibility, I personally have seen the photos of tortured bodies that are difficult to unsee just because it's unpopular.
Ms. Roby?
Thank you, Congressman. My organization represents 11 victims, Venezuelan victims who were detained at Secot, who were tortured and abused in all forms. We also represent lawyer Enrique Anaya, who has been arbitrarily detained since June 2025. He was also enforced disappeared. He has pre-existing health conditions. His life is at risk. And he continues to be detained. Actually, his detention was prolonged last December. He was detained after Ruth Lopez, and he has been subjected to several abuse, including the denial of his medication. He suffers from type 2 diabetes, he has a liver condition, etc. So I would say it is very inaccurate and irresponsible to write an information like that, and I would encourage this commission to publish its own alternative report. Thank you.
Mr. House?
Gracias, congresista. Nosotros en la APES tenemos documentados los casos y mandamos todos los reportes a la Embajada de los Estados Unidos de El Salvador. Tenemos un centro de monitoreo que ha documentado los exilios, que ha documentado las infecciones con Pegasus y que ha documentado las peticiones de información que hemos hecho a la Fiscalía para saber si hay algún proceso legal en contra de algunos periodistas de El Salvador.
At the Association of Journalists El Salvador, they have a monitoring system. They've been tracking journalists in exile. They've been tracking requests on open processes to journalists, and the issues this has been fully shared with the U.S. Embassy in El Salvador.
Let me just, I mean, does anyone disagree with the statement that the government of El Salvador does have a responsibility to provide the safety of its citizens from gang violence? Anyone disagree with that? Right? Okay. Is the government of El Salvador, does anyone believe that the government of El Salvador is exempted from its obligations to abide by international human rights standards in order to address gang violence?
I'm not sure what standards we're referring to. What I'll say is that some of what as I've testified in my testimony, the approach that has been mandated basically by Washington and for much of the expert class on to Latin American governments as far as how we approach narco-terrorist organizations, how governments approach those as pure law enforcement threats is something that I don't think is appropriate. I think it's a shifting in the framework to recognize that these organizations are foreign terrorist organizations, armed insurgencies, and the traditional law enforcement approach is no longer appropriate.
We can put that aside. I guess the things that concern me most right now are the reports that I have heard firsthand and the reports that I see documented in various human rights reports of people who are not members of gangs, of people who, quite frankly, are at political odds with the current government of El Salvador, who end up in jail. People who end up in jail where there's no evidence, don't have due process, and then we find out that they die in jail. I mean, when we talk about kind of international norms when it comes to human rights, I mean, those are the things that I'm thinking about. Does the popularity of the head of government exempt that government from its obligations to abide by international human rights standards? I mean, here's the thing that drives me crazy. I mean, my co-chair and I will probably disagree on, on President Bukele. But I don't see how those who support President Bukele, are doing him any favors by kind of, by hiding some obvious, problems with the way the system is being run right now, where, where people are being jailed who shouldn't be jailed, where journalists are being forced out of the country, for fear of their lives. I mean, that's just real. I don't think Mr. Arauz left El Salvador because, he just wanted to go to Costa Rica. I mean, he left because he felt he had to. I met with families whose sons who died mysteriously in the COMPLICIT prison, who begged me after we met with them not to reveal their identities because they have other sons and daughters. Their fear was real. It wasn't made up, it's real. And quite frankly, this administration, no matter what their position is on Bukele, ought to be demanding better, ought to be demanding more. And again, I said at the beginning, I really, I think the Salvadoran people deserve better. When I remember in the 1980s, we were being told that everything was perfect, that the Salvadoran military was guilty of no human rights violations. I remember when the Jesuits were murdered in 1989, the first words out of our government was it was the FMLN who did it. Well, it turned out it was the U.S.-backed Salvadoran Armed Forces, 24 of the 26 triggermen trained in the United States with U.S. with U.S. weapons. I mean, when you deny these things, it doesn't make them go away. It makes it look like you're covering up something, maybe even worse than it is in this case. Mr. Bullock and Mr. Papier, the Salvadoran government NGO Humanitarian Legal Assistance estimates that at least 470 people have died in El Salvador's prisons since the state of exception began. What are the government's obligations under international human rights law regarding conditions of the incarcerated? And is the government making any effort to live up to these obligations? I mean, does that government bear any responsibility for any of these deaths?
As I mentioned in my opening statement, our organization has gone through that register of reported deaths and done an exhaustive investigation, gathering documentary, testimonial, and forensic evidence about each individual case. And when we mention the number of 420 fully investigated cases that we can attribute to responsibility of the state, it's based on that methodology of investigation. And so I think our organization can confirm that there are people dying in large numbers in the prisons as a consequence of action or intentional inaction of the state. The responsibilities of the state to people who are incarcerated are established in what's called the Mandela rules, and those should be applied independently of any other circumstances on the basis of fundamental human dignity. We also, as an organization, had the opportunity to do inspections of the maximum security prisons at the end of the Sanchez-Serén administration. The prisons were under states of exception for 5 years. We were able to go in and witness humans in a condition that I've never personally seen. Abuses and mistreatment, overpopulation in the prisons is chronic in El Salvador. But what's changed between the previous administration and this one is a culture of intentionality about torture. That's one of the things that I feel like I personally learned when we investigated with Human Rights Watch the torture of the Venezuelans. We saw the physical condition in the propaganda videos of the prisoners at COMPLICIT and compared that to the physical conditions that we know about people who are being held in other maximum security prisons, where the majority of people captured in the state of exception are being held, not in COMPLICIT. And we assumed that the people in COMPLICIT were potentially being treated better. But when we learned from overwhelming testimonial evidence backed by forensic analysis, the patterns of torture in COMPLICIT, the things that guards say and threats that they make, the practices of torture coincide exactly with the same patterns we've documented in other prisons, indicating that torture has become a state policy within the Salvadoran prisons. It highlighted the level of institutionality that there is around the practices of torture in the prisons.
Thank you, Congressman. As Mr. Bullock mentioned, the rules governing prisons under international human rights standards are laid out in detail in the Mandela principles, and we have identified violations to these Mandela rules in several prisons in El Salvador, not only in CICOT, also in Mariona, in Izalco, El Penalito, and in some cases in juvenile detention facilities. The rules, Mandela rules violated include those concerning overcrowding, access to food, access to water, access to medical attention, and the rules governing solitary confinement. In addition, for any death occurring in a prison, authorities are required to investigate it, to investigate the causes of the death, and to provide their families with information about the reason of these deaths. We have not seen any serious investigation into any of the deaths we investigated in Salvadorian prisons. Much to the contrary, we know from public announcement that some cases were closed without a proper investigation, and we know of some cases where people who died in prison were buried without informing their relatives that these people had been buried and had died in prison several months before the families learned about it. So I would say the rules set out in international human rights law, in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, in the UN Convention Against Torture, in the Mandela Principle, we found many violations to these rules.
And I'm going to yield to Mr. Smith and see if Mr. Vargas has any final questions before we finish up. Can I ask you, when was the last time you were in El Salvador? Yeah. Great. Yeah, we'll go right down the list. Yeah.
El 21 de mayo del año pasado. Salí 2 días después de la captura de Ruth López.
May 21st last year.
Okay. Ms. Roby?
I was there in April, the first week of April or a little bit later, 2025, and we were trying to meet with our clients who were held at CICOT. And I have to say, after that trip, lots of things changed. In May, they arrested Ruth. In June, they arrested Enrique Anaya. Then Cristo Sal was forced to cease operations. And they were kind enough to actually share their space when we went and to organize meetings with survivors of the state of exception and victims of the state of exception, as well as journalists. So a lot of things changed from that moment on.
Was the U.S. Embassy helpful?
No, it was not. And we did contact the U.S. Embassy and El Salvador Embassy to try to gain access to CICOT to meet with our clients.
Mr. Bullock, when was the last time you were there?
I don't remember the exact date, but it was the afternoon after Enrique Anaya was arrested at his home. I left the country along with a significant group of other human rights defenders and journalists. Other members of our staff left later after receiving threats that their names were on blacklists of people who would be detained, and other members of our staff were receiving visits by police officers at their homes, and their homes were being monitored.
Congressman, I was last there in 2024. Because of the changing conditions in 2025, that year I did not visit El Salvador. But I'm hoping I'll be able to return soon to continue our documentation. We have teams that try to go periodically to interview victims and review documentation there.
And are your teams still able to get in without any problem? Or?
We are updating our security protocols to adjust to the current situation in the country, including the fact that the human rights defenders like Ruth Lopez has been detained. So that's kind of the challenge we're facing now.
Mr. Couto?
Yes, several members of the group of experts were there in 2024, I believe.
Mr. Martinez-Fernandez?
I don't like to share publicly details of my travel, but I was there earlier this year.
Okay, good. All right, let me yield to Mr. Smith.
Okay, thank you. Let me just ask you, to you, you did say that you objected to the Biden administration's State Department and Human Rights Office when they said, and I quote it, "The government took credible steps to identify and punish officials who may have committed human rights abuses." How did they respond to that?
I criticized that statement in the press. You will find
But not with them?
I cannot recall, but it's likely. It's likely that I did. I did comment it on the press. You can find an article in El Faro where I comment on that specific sentence and overall on that report.
Because, I think it behooves us to know what they thought, what went into this determination, which is identical to the determination that's been made by the Trump administration. And, you know, if indeed it's true, and the government is going after people who commit atrocities, it needs to be all out on the table and acknowledged. Did anybody in Human Rights Watch contact the Department of State to get their view as to why they came to that conclusion? Because it didn't just drop out of thin air.
I cannot recall right now what conversation we had with the State Department regarding El Salvador at the time. That was a couple of years ago. But
We're talking about the 2023 Human Rights Report.
Yeah, exactly. I cannot recall exactly what meetings I had, but I did express publicly that I disagree with some of the findings in that report.
Okay, yes.
I'll just share a couple of experiences that we've had in seeking accountability. I also don't know concretely anything that would back the statement that you're reading, that there are significant actions or improvements to build accountability. Our lawyers have represented children who have been raped, tortured, forcibly disappeared or killed by Salvadoran security forces in criminal trials. I'm not allowed to speak about those because
But have any of those people been prosecuted that committed those atrocities?
That's what I'm saying, is that our lawyers represented families in criminal cases against the members of the security forces. I'm not allowed to speak at length about them because they're secret.
I'm not asking for names.
But
I'm
what I
asking
can say is
whether or
that
not
those did not
people were
lead into
prosecuted as they
convictions.
should be and thrown into prison for the maximum allowable by
And that is
law.
not what the outcome of the cases have been. They have been released. In other cases, our lawyers who represent people with physical disabilities, mental disabilities, chronic health who have been detained in the state of exception, they've been witnesses in hearings of prisoners trying to denounce torture to judges and their denouncements being ignored by the courts. And so it does seem difficult for us to see where those avenues are for accountability. In our experience, impunity has been the rule.
Well, that is a very broad statement, and you do have your reasons for saying it, but the U.S. Department of State's Human Rights Office, I have found over the decades through various administrations, Republican and Democrat, have tried painstakingly to just be truthful and speak truth to power, no matter what country we're talking about. If it's a friendly ally, you speak out against them as well. If it's not, you do the same. I would point out, parenthetically, different subject, but it showed, I think, integrity. George W. Bush, after I did the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, he put Israel and South Korea on tier 3 because of their egregious human rights violations vis-a-vis human trafficking. And they worked overtime for the next year to get off it, and they did. But he called it the way it should be called. In like manner, the Religious Freedom Act has that capability to name CPC countries, and it should never be manipulated in any way. And again, I think the Biden administration State Department, because I worked with them a lot, even if I had a disagreement on something, they were trying to get to help victims and to prevent bad behavior in the first place. So, I don't know why the Biden people would say that, and I can't stress that enough. That's who has been prosecuted? We'll go back and ask again to try to get that information. But if that's what the Bukele government is doing, we need to acknowledge that. I do think, and I would agree with Mr. Martinez when he said earlier that comparing this government to North Korea is an outrage. I work with human rights in China, North Korea, all of these despotic countries all the time. The North Korean Human Rights Act, when we passed that, I was the prime mover, one of the prime movers of it. And you can't compare a guy that systematically tortures and kills people to a dictator like we have in Pyongyang, and ditto for the dictator that we have in Beijing, in Xi Jinping. I don't think this man is a dictator. He got elected by 84% of the vote. And really a threshold question. And again, means do matter in how you get there. But why did the murder rate drop by 98%? I mean, taking bad people off the streets who murder and rape and maim and traffic, to me, is the essence of government. Now, you got to make sure you do it in a way that is above board. Due process rights need to be followed, which is why I'm trying to say, why did Joe Biden and Trump both come to the same conclusion that the bad guys are being prosecuted within the government? Let me also say, just as a matter of interest, I think, many of the prisons in Central and South America, I've been to Palomasaro prison in Santa Cruz twice, and there, just like they used to do in El Salvador under the Arena Party as well as under the FMLN, the prisoners ran the place. You know, they had cell blocks that they ran. In the case of that particular prison, the guards were on the outskirts and the prisoners were all inside. And I had an American that was trying to get out of that prison. I went to the prison and was shocked and dismayed by that. I don't know anybody else who was raising it in Congress, but I had some hearings on that one as well. So I just, you know, we want to get to due process rights that are transparent, but why do we have a 98% reduction in murder? Because the bad guy seems to be off the streets. Go ahead, please.
Just for the record, the homicide reductions began 3 years before President Bukele took office. You mentioned the date 2015 was the peak of the
Right.
of the violence, and that was reduced from 103 to 100,000 down to 43.
But has it gotten better?
Statistically,
Has it
President
gotten
Bukele
better? Let me
couldn't
answer
have.
that. Has the murder rate and the other atrocities being committed by criminals and by gangs gotten better in El Salvador? Yes or no?
We've acknowledged the improvement in the security environment in relation to gangs. I think it's important also to acknowledge that the premise that it was necessary to restrict fundamental freedoms and perpetrate mass human rights violations is not sustained statistically. The previous administration reduced homicide rates with human rights problems, but not with the state of exception in the way that it's been used in this administration.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yield back.
Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to
Yeah.
make one point. I think one of the issues is, again, you highlight the prison systems across Latin America and the Caribbean. One of the issues that I think a lot of people have with some of the criticisms that are being levied against the Bukele government and the enforcement efforts is that certainly there are a lot of issues that need to be addressed. But within the context, they're completely removed from the context of what exists not only and has existed not only in El Salvador, but across the Western Hemisphere and really across the world. Pre-trial detentions, for example, they're an issue, but it's not unique to El Salvador. The issues as far as prison security and violence and abuse by guards, that is certainly a challenge, but it's not a new challenge that resulted as a result of Bukele coming to power. Certainly, a lot of that has been those kinds of challenges are highlighted to a greater degree when you have this mass influx of individuals into the prison system. And I think that there's a role for the United States to work proactively in building institutions and ensuring that these kinds of abuses don't occur. But unfortunately, I think really the approach that unfortunately the Biden administration took at the beginning of this effort, which was to cut off engagement, cut off security cooperation, levy these criticisms from abroad, and basically leave the Salvadoran government alone to confront that, it removed our ability to now credibly come and say, well, we should engage proactively and make these changes now that you've made all these gains in security, and particularly in this environment, I just don't think that the idea of we're going to impose, for example, an international commission. As a Salvadoran, I would be insulted by that kind of proposal coming from, again, Washington, where we basically cut off that kind of cooperation and support when they were most engaged in confronting this dire security threat.
Just real quick, is there any evidence of any inmate on inmate crime? We know in our own prisons, the rapes in our prisons, the murders do occur. Is there any evidence of that? in El Salvador? Inmate on inmate crime.
You mean abuses committed between
Inside
inmates?
the prisons, do inmates,
Yeah, absolutely there is. Yes, yes.
Uh,
we have documented
to
that
what extent?
and included that in our report. For example, we have documented cases of violence by inmates, cases of sexual violence by inmates, including cases of sexual violence in juvenile detention facilities. Those are cases we have documented and included in our reports.
Do
Yes.
any of those murders that you speak of, and that's horrific, is any of that attributable to inmate on inmate crime?
The cases of people who have died in prison, we don't know if they are attributed to other inmates. We don't know also if they're attributed to the guards. And the reason we don't know that is because there are no meaningful investigations in El Salvador. We're barely able to obtain sometimes a death certificate that in some cases is very confusing about the causes of death, and there are no meaningful investigations about who killed those people who died in prison.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Vargas? Was it?
Yes, once again, I appreciate the opportunity to sit here. Both of the co-chairs have a very well-deserved reputation for being human rights champions, and again, it comes from different perspectives, but both of you, and I appreciate, again, the opportunity to be here. I do have a lot of sympathy and interest in El Salvador because of my own history. I have to say that, listening to the conversations here between the witnesses and also those of us up here, I mean, it seems obvious that the country is safer. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I don't think there's any doubt that we want bad guys off the street. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I don't think there's any doubt either that good people have been taken off the street too. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Have there been abuses? Of course there have. There's abuses everywhere. I mean, it's impossible to say that it's run by angels. It's not the case. And I do think that this is a situation where the United States should be more involved, and international actors. I mean, it's interesting, we're involved all over the world, and no one takes insult to that, or maybe they do. And some, I'm sure, do. But we should be involved. And we should. We are. In fact, I can tell you that for a fact. There's even things I can't tell you because they're classified that show that we are involved in the world. And I think this is one of the places where we should, because I do think that there are opportunities here to work together to make sure the situation is better. And I am glad that we're looking at it from different perspectives, and hopefully we can find common ground to make the situation better. And with that, I do appreciate the opportunity to sit with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And so I want to ask unanimous consent to include in the hearing record a statement from the Knight First Amendment Institute, a statement from the Committee to Protect Journalists, the report entitled You Have Arrived in Hell from Human Rights Watch in Cristasol, the GIPES report entitled El Salvador at the Crossroads, Crimes Against Humanity under the Public Security Policy. Let me just close by saying, as this commission does its work, we monitor many governments who say that there is a necessary trade-off between security and rights here all the time. And they're run by leaders who say this to basically cement their own power and to stay in office and to justify things that, quite frankly, can't and should not be justified. I believe the record shows that President Bukele is one of those leaders. That is my conclusion. As someone who's followed him, for a long, long time. Our mandate is to review government behavior against human rights standards. We must do so without fear or favor. In life, we depend on our best friends to tell us when we're doing things wrong. And I consider myself a friend of the Salvadoran people. I've been traveling there since the early 1980s. They're incredible people, and quite frankly, they deserve a hell of a lot better from us and from other allies around the world. They don't want gang violence. Neither does anybody up here. Neither does anybody who has testified today. To say that there's only one way to address this violence is false. Anyone in El Salvador who suggests that there is a different way than Bukele's way, and as I've talked to these people, they face threats. They're forced to leave the country. Some of them have been jailed. Some of them have been tortured. And again, many living in exile. And anyone in Washington who suggests that there is a different way too often gets labeled as pro-gang, or you favor all the past in terms of violence and gang violence. That's just not the case. That's insulting, quite frankly. So we can look to international standards for guidance on how to give the Salvadoran people security through a rights-based framework, and that's my choice. And I wish our government would choose that too. I just say one final thing, and that is, this hearing should be an indication to those in power in El Salvador that people are watching and more closely paying attention to what is happening. And I got to tell you, I mean, you know, you can exile everybody who questions, you know, what's going on in the government all that you want. That's not going to change our focus and our interest in what's going on. We care about human rights, and we're concerned about the current situation. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate in the future. This hearing has come to a...